All right, good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Good. I'd just like to welcome you all to the Program Executive Office for Ground Combat Systems Media Roundtable. We've got about 30 to 45 minutes here, and most of it's going to be just open dialogue and Q&A. I'd like to just take a moment to introduce our panel. First, we have Major General David Bassett, the PEO for Ground Combat Systems. Next to him, we have Colonel Glenn Dean, the PM for Stryker Brigade Combat Team, followed by Colonel Jim Shermer, the PM for Armored Fighting Vehicles, Colonel Mike Milner, the PM for Armored Multipurpose Vehicle, and Mr. Andrew DeMarco, the PM for Main Battle Tank Systems. What we're going to do is General Bassett's going to open up with a few comments, just highlighting what's going on in the Ground Combat Systems portfolio, talk about a few things that are new and exciting and what we've been working on, and then we'll just open it up to Q&A. I'd like to limit to 2 questions to start with, and then if anybody has any follow-on questions afterwards, we can do that. Great? Okay, sir.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right. You know, it's been just a little more than a year since the Army approved its combat vehicle modernization strategy last year at AUSA. And over the last 12 months, I think we've been in a really dynamic time for combat vehicles for our Army, in spite of what is widely recognized as a resource environment which is not sufficient for the systems that we need for our forces. So the CVMS outlined 3 new capabilities predominantly focused on our IBCTs, the Light Reconnaissance Vehicle, the Ultralight Combat Vehicle, and Mobile Protected Firepower. Only the last one, Mobile Protected Firepower, is in my portfolio, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on today. For our ABCT systems, our Armor Brigade combat teams, we're at, I think, a really pivotal time for the development of our force. So we have upgraded versions of the Abrams, the SEP-V3 that's in test today. We have an upgraded version of the Bradley that's in test today. And we have an upgraded Stryker for our WV Hull Strykers with the engineering change proposal updates. Each of those are focused on adding the capability to our combat vehicles and carrying the Army's network, as well as positioning those systems for the future. In any resource environment, we're not going to modernize our force fast enough that we're not going to have tanks and Bradleys in our Army for a very long time. And so these kinds of upgrades really position us to be able to respond to a dynamic threat environment and to have a system with some design margin that allows us to fight effectively. We also we'll take here very shortly, by the end of December, we'll take delivery of the first armored multi-purpose vehicle into government tests, which is the culmination of more than a year of design efforts with our prime vendor. And we're now focused on building the prototypes that are necessary for our EMD test phase. And so the AMPV program, under our budget estimates, on schedule, and moving forward quite effectively. And hopefully you've gotten a chance to check out the medical evacuation vehicle down at the booth downstairs. I think this is the first time many Army senior leaders have gotten to see that platform, and it's given them some insight into the trade-offs that we're going to face on all future combat vehicles between interior space, protection levels, weight, size. AMPV is built to a set of requirements, and I think across the board we see that as a system that the Army can fight out of going forward. It gives us enough protection for a full range of operational environments, as well as providing the size inside for soldiers, as well as not being so large outside that it presents a problem. We run into the situation now where almost any vehicle we build is criticized for being too small on the inside and too big on the outside. And we haven't come up with a technology that's going to change that, but we are looking at how pragmatically we can balance those 2 factors. The Stryker lethality program that was just getting started last year around this time will deliver its first vehicle into test by the end of December. On budget, actually under budget, on schedule, to meet the needs of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Europe as we add additional lethality into that formation. And that's been a tremendous success in terms of the cooperation between General Dynamics and Kongsberg, who was selected as the turret vendor. We held a competition late last year to select the turret and the integration of that turret competitively. And the PM, as they've looked at balancing the risk of developing a new system with the schedule that's desired to move out aggressively and quickly. And so in an era where everybody talks about acquisition reform, and they point to the acquisition process as bureaucracy-laden and something that keeps us from getting what we need. The gentlemen to my left have been able to take that acquisition process, tailor it to what they're buying, and make pragmatic, common sense choices about how best to proceed. And so we're across the board delivering to our estimates and delivering capability now after some time and investment. And so there was a study done a number of years ago that looked at the acquisition process. And they said, if you built nothing, right, if you said, we're not really building anything, just going through the process, how long will that take? And the answer was a certain number of years just to go through the bureaucracy. At the same time now, when I turn over to these guys, I say, look, imagine that the bureaucracy took no time whatsoever, and how long will it take you to actually go build a combat vehicle with all of its parts and complexity? And that's also not that short. By the time you energize that supply chain, and for these guys, I said, don't make it about the process, make it about design, build, test, and field. And tell me how long that takes, and let's make sure that we can handle the bureaucracy in parallel to the things we have to do anyway, so that it doesn't take any longer than necessary to get quality systems out to our soldiers. And so we've done that on systems like striker lethality, where we've bent the process to our will. We got the acquisition process largely out of the way, and in fact, Congress was kind enough to budget the money up front for striker lethality. So now, as we face a continuing resolution environment, striker lethality is unaffected because they got their money in the first year. And so I don't like PMs that tell me that they can't get something done because of the process. The process is what it is. We'll make some changes to it. We'll improve it over time. But I like PMs who can bend the process to their will. They can get meaningful, common sense decisions out in front of Army leadership. And the Chief's involvement in acquisition over the last 12 months has been nothing but beneficial in terms of making sure that he's got a clear sight picture on what we're asking our acquisition professionals to deliver, and then laying out the real time it takes to design, build, test, and field combat vehicles. Just for some comparison points, GM may come out with a new car every year, but when they build a whole new product line, that's an investment that happens over many years. And Apple may give you a new iPhone every year, but I guarantee you the development of the iPhone didn't start when they released the iPhone 7. In fact, Samsung right now, I think, is figuring out that maybe some of their processes didn't work that well. It comes down for us to activities and not necessarily process. So we have to deal with it, but I've asked the team to identify where we can tailor it and where we can get the decisions elevated to the right level in the Army, where we can get whatever waivers we need, so that we're doing the right amount of tests, the right amount of design, and we're delivering quality vehicles out the back end. And so in this environment, where we're frequently criticized for not delivering, we've got new vehicles, new versions of Abrams, Bradley, and Stryker in test. The PIM is in its operational test right now and in low-rate production, and PIM is delivering under budget. And Stryker lethality, which was just in its genesis a year ago, will deliver under budget and on schedule with the first vehicle into test this year. So I know there's never a lot of reporting on good acquisition news, but across the board, this team is delivering, and I certainly look forward to your questions.
Does anybody else? Dan?
For the urgent need, where does it stand for the overall fleet, and how will that touch the urgent need program, if at all?
Okay. So we have the pleasure to announce that just 2 weeks ago, we received the approval to start what we're calling ECP2, which is the Fleet Lethality Program for Stryker. A little bit different than our prior ECP programs. The current ongoing Stryker ECP is an automotive and powertrain upgrade that addresses the entire fleet, so it's common to all platforms. ECP2 is intended to address mission equipment package across a number of the individual variants of the Stryker fleet, each of which provides a contribution to lethality. So it will be actually multiple programs flying in formation, if that makes any sense. The first two elements of that, which were what were green-lighted just 2 weeks ago, is giving us the ability to fire the Javelin missile under armor from the remote weapon station on the Stryker, and making improvements to our anti-tank guided missile vehicle by bringing its co-acquisition subsystem essentially up to the caliber of the ITAP that's deployed on tow Humvees. So it gives us far target locate and networked lethality and some optics upgrade capability. So that's the first two elements. The continuation, what everyone is looking for, of what else are you doing for cannon-armed strikers for 2CR, will be shifted to the right to allow us to take advantage of some opportunities. The first opportunity is learning from what 2CR does when they field the first 30mm armed vehicles. There's a lot of discussion within the striker community about what's the right operating concept for a cannon-armed striker. Is it still the infantry carrier as envisioned, simply supported by a longer range, more lethal weapon, or do you begin to shape the formation differently when you add that capability? The 2CR deployment will allow us to gain data to answer that question. Second, we have an S&T project going on with the Armaments Research and Development Center, Picatinny, to continue to mature 30mm cannon, fire control. We've got some novel fire control ideas, all of which we want to use in the next iteration of cannon-armed strikers. And so given those opportunities, what we see is that we will re-engage what would be a competitive acquisition for a cannon-armed vehicle sometime in the 19 to 20 time frame, let requirements based on what we learned from 2CR settle out, and then apply that solution across the fleet. The requirements could be very close to what we're doing for 2nd Cavalry Regiment, or they could be significantly different depending on what the Army learns and what potential threats and concepts push it. But in the interim, we're launching the RWS Javelin effort and LITES upgrade.
So what I asked Glenn to lay out was the best plan for the dollars he had. And that created some opportunities to learn from these other things as opposed to rolling directly into another cannon program. Frequently, we seem to get criticized for not laying out plans for money we don't have. And so across the board, the way we're affording all the things we're affording is by producing things at really low rates, which gives us some operational flexibility to ramp up if dollars are available, but create fairly slow modernization across our formation and cause us to pay more than we necessarily would have to for the same system. So the production rates on AMP-V are going to be modest when we start producing. I'm sure Mike will give you the production rate on that. The production rates on Stryker for the ECP could be as little as 1 brigade every 3 years, because you're just not giving it the level of resources that create an efficient production rate. And the modernization rate of tanks and Bradleys are going to be certainly less than a brigade a year. It's not clear how much less than a brigade a year, but it will be less than a brigade a year. And those are all symptoms of that budget environment. So please don't take away from this. Because I tell you that we're delivering on budget and on schedule doesn't mean that the resources in this portfolio are sufficient for what the Army is asking us to do. But we're paying for it on the back end with relatively slow production rates and with extended time frames necessary to touch all the vehicles in the fleet.
In fact, we're
ECP-1, not ECP.
We are fielding our 3rd Double B Hull Brigade right now. It's without the ECP. We built that over 3 years. In fact, we started fielding as the tail end of production is still ongoing because it takes us that long. The 4th Brigade, which will be the first built with the powertrain upgrades from Stryker ECP-1, right now envisioned to be built over 3 years.
Across all your programs, what is the status of work on active protection systems? There's been a lot of interest in the Russians doing things with active protection in Ukraine, the Russians and the not officially Russians. And I know there's been a lot of high-level interest in the Army in finding a near-term solution as well as developing maps as sort of the long-term overarching solution.
Yeah, so I think you've got it right. The Army's got really a two-part approach for developing active protection. The longer-term strategy through maps to give us a system that's adaptable and modular to use across any potential vehicle in our family, and then some near-term efforts that Glenn can get into that look at installing, characterizing, and then giving Army senior leaders the right amount of data to make a good decision about whether some off-the-shelf systems can be employed in the nearer term. Glenn?
Yeah, so active protection's hard. I mean, I really hate to be the guy responsible for active protection. Oh wait, that's me. So I'm taking the lead for PEO Ground Combat Systems for our expedited active protection system effort. It's a partnership with TARDEC. It's actually a subset of the MAPS program. We're taking activities that were going to occur after MAPS transition to a program of record, which is planned in about the 20 time frame as their sort of common architecture matures. And that's the vehicle integration activities, right? So we decided how do you go faster? Take a bunch of those activities that you need to learn and prepare for and bring them up and execute them more or less in parallel with the technology development. So expedited active protection is an activity to take non-developmental or claimed non-developmental active protection systems, install them on our combat platforms, characterize them so we can define both what the active protection systems do and what those impacts are on the host platform. Challenging problem. All of our platforms are challenged for space, weight, power. How much additional space, weight, and power is needed for an APS? What capability can be traded off, if any, in order to accept the APS? And then what environments, what tactics, techniques, and procedures need to change? What level of performance is acceptable? Expedited APS will drive to an Army decision point right now, probably late 17, where we lay out, okay, for the NDI systems that are participating, what's their level of performance as demonstrated in the series of characterization testing that we do? What are the impacts of the platforms? What are the unknowns? So safety qualification. How much risk are you willing to assume? Are the systems that we see, they meet all of our existing safety standards? If they don't, are you willing to accept some risk in that area? And if so, or if you're not willing to take all that risk, what additional activity do we need to do to burn down that risk before you make a decision about fielding? And then if there is an urgent need and there is sufficient acceptance of level of performance, then we can move on potentially to fielding one of those NDI systems as an interim until we transition to a MAPS baseline.
I think it's important to realize that APS is not the kind of thing that you just strap on and go. It's got to be tailored and tuned to the system that you apply it to, because each vehicle presents a different radar picture that has to be processed for each of, for whatever sensors that have to detect incoming threats. The effectors are in different places on different vehicles, and it takes some work, takes some engineering labor to do that, and we're doing that work today in partnership with TARDEC. And so the timelines associated with putting APS on a vehicle that we're working towards are extraordinarily fast, because you got to go source you got to source the effectors and the whole system, and then you got to match it to the platform. And that matching to the platform is not something that's either trivial or short. So it takes a certain amount of testing to perform that, as well as to demonstrate the capabilities of that system.
The fact that the Striker guy is the lead, does that mean we're going to test this on Striker first, or maybe even install Striker first, or is that we happen to move slowest at the meeting?
No. So I like having individual colonels that are responsible for things, and we already had poor Colonel Jim Shermer in charge of MPF, and Glenn had a little extra time on his hands.
Right. So I am coordinating the activities across the three programs. The individual platforms, of course, are making their technical decisions associated with their systems, but we're trying to make sure they are using the same structure. That we've got a very detailed series of questions that we intend to ask and then answer to the extent we can through characterization. As you imagine, we're talking about a 1-year activity. So in about 6 months of that is the design and build portion, and then about 6 months of that is the characterization. And you'll note that I use the term install and characterize very deliberately. So what we are not doing at this phase is integrating those systems. For example, I'm not going to crack into the Abrams software to make sure it interfaces at a subsystem level with an APS system. Because what if you pick the wrong APS system? Redoing platform level software is expensive, time-consuming, and risky. And you kind of want to make sure you're close with the system that you're going to integrate when you finally get to that point. So we're doing an installation. It's an applique, intended to be a fieldable applique, assuming the Army's are willing to take whatever risks that we learn along the process. But as we're already seeing as we begin down this road, the close coupling between the design of the APS and the way that it is installed or integrated on the platform is very critical to your overall performance. Now, I use the term characterize instead of test because we're intending to show what the system does as opposed to walking in with, here's the no-go point. If you don't meet this bar, you do not go forward, so that the Army can then sort of set its requirements bar appropriately if we're willing to submit.
Matt?
Could you talk a little bit about active protective, or mobile protective firepower, and also have you seen the demonstrator down at GD that they put together to kind of address this want from MCOE?
Yeah, I mean, it's right in the door there. I don't know if I could miss it. Yeah.
Hard to miss.
Pardon?
Hard to miss.
It is hard to miss. So I'm really encouraged that General Dynamics would take the time and the money to kind of show their version of sort of the art of the possible by taking some existing vehicles and bringing them together in a way that helps us understand that requirement better. There's a difference between sort of a tech demonstrator concept vehicle and a production-ready vehicle. And so in our mobile protected firepower strategy, we very much wanted to get the Army to speak definitively on requirements and then give industry an opportunity to provide feedback on those requirements in the form of some written white papers and some other dialogue, and then also to give industry time to get ready for a fairly rapid production program. So the time that any program takes really, I kind of keep going back to design, build, and test. Well, in any program, you're either going to pay industry to design it or you're not. And what we've said in MPF is we're not willing to wait for you to go through a lengthy bottoms-up design process. What we are willing to do is to give you some time on your own to get a design ready to compete, and then we'll evaluate that into a fairly rapid engineering, manufacturing, and development phase, not unlike what the Marine Corps, say, has done with ACV 1.1, where they kind of projected the requirements to industry, got some feedback, did some risk mitigation activities, and then really laid out a program where they didn't pay industry to design very much. They asked them to deliver within a fairly short period of time. We're trying to model that same kind of strategy. And I think much like that strategy, the best way to execute the strategy on MPF were if we had sufficient resources to get more than one vendor. So although we're still in the early stages of laying out the total resources that will be necessary to do this, I think we can learn a lot from the Marine Corps and from other programs that have gone down this path, like JLTV, where we benefited greatly from the competition of having more than one vendor.
What is it exactly you want in MPF? I mean, do you want a light tank? Do you want something that's airdroppable? Can you lay it out for us?
So, and I'm not just going to dish this to Jim because you asked a hard question. So we laid out a framework of requirements, which described kind of the left and right limit, and those went all the way up to General Milley at the AROC, along with the other 4-stars. And so those requirements were things like 32 tons max weight. Those are requirements like a set of targets that you need at least a 50-millimeter cannon to destroy, certain levels of protection. And we shared that with industry down at Fort Benning. General Wesley, the new Maneuver Center commander, we had a session with industry to lay out those kinds of requirements. And so the airdrop requirement is one that clearly, if the vehicle is 32 tons, it's not airdroppable. At the same time, we wanted to make sure that we left our requirements at this stage broad enough so that we understood the full breadth of what might be possible. So we're not saying we want a light tank. We're saying we want a system for the infantry brigade combat team that offers mobility, protection, and firepower, and we're giving the technical requirements of how much mobility, how much protection, and how much firepower. Now, the vehicles that you've seen shown here at AUSA that BAE has got the M8 sitting out front and General Dynamics has their tech demonstrator. You could argue those look like light tanks. But we're trying to be open-minded about, this is about a certain amount of effects, a certain amount of protection, and a certain amount of mobility.
Chris?
These requirements are still evolving, I would imagine. Can you give us any additional specs as far as how fast this might go or what kinds of munitions it might fire, what kinds of mission sets it would be ideally suited for?
I'm gonna let Jim answer that.
Okay, so The draft requirements have been communicated to industry at an industry day back at Fort Benning, so we put out kind of the high-level requirements. We're not all the way down, obviously, to a product spec, although we're starting to work on that pretty soon. This is going to go into all the IBCTs, so what you know about the IBCT, those are the sorts of missions you can expect. So generally austere environments, it's got to be able to go where the infantryman goes, which is one of the reasons why the Army's interested in a smaller vehicle, not quite the size of an Abrams tank, for example, because in a lot of these more austere environments, you can expect bridges that can't support heavier armor. You can expect narrow streets. But the Army was looking for a tracked vehicle because we want to be able to go over rubble buildings, if there's burned out cars or whatever, we want to be able to just drive over the top of them. So some of those, the ability to move with the infantry is pretty important. I think that drove some of the mobility requirements as well as the desire to keep it fairly small. On the lethality side, again, we're in a resource-constrained environment, so the Army really doesn't want to pay to develop a new suite of ammunition. So the desire is to keep the weapon to something that's already in the Army inventory. So that would probably be 105 or 120, although the lower threshold set at 50. There was a 57 millimeter program, and I think some of the senior leaders were interested in. I think the Navy has that weapon. I suspect it's a little large for this particular vehicle. We haven't fully investigated that yet. Nevertheless, we don't want to develop a new suite of ammunition, so it's probably going to be one of those two. And again, remember, MPF is part of a suite of vehicles. So the IBCT is going to be getting the ground mobility vehicle, the light reconnaissance vehicle, and the MPF. So if LRV comes in with a medium cal cannon, that plus the Javelin the soldiers already have, then the MPF really brings that larger gun for bunkers that are too large for a medium cal cannon to take care of, or if there's perhaps light armored vehicles that are encountered, then there's a lot of capability. We have a pretty robust suite of 105 ammunition as well as 120, so there's a lot of targets you can address with that.
Steve?
So my question is more about the overall modernization program for the Army. Right now, you're modernizing the Abrams, you're modernizing the Bradley, you're modernizing the Stryker, but these are all, most of these vehicles have been around for quite some time. There are competitors out there who are developing new vehicles, like the Russian Armata family, for example, or the Chinese with their Type 99. Have you guys started looking at the future of what might eventually happen? I mean, the Abrams can't go on forever. I mean, are you looking at something like a follow-on?
I think you got to look at where you get to the limits of where those platforms can be evolved. Frequently, you get this. People will say things like, well, the Abrams you have today is the same Abrams tank you had, 20 or 30 years ago. And the truth is they're nothing like one another. And so we're looking at what are those technologies and capabilities that you can get on the existing vehicle so that you can evolve maybe at a lower cost given the constraints in the portfolio versus what are those capabilities that you really have to replace the vehicle to go out and get. And so when the Army allowed the ground combat vehicle to conclude, geez, am I still talking around that? When we allowed that program to end at the end of this technology development phase, we did a lot of analysis that showed that the investments that we're making in Bradley, Abrams, Paladin, and AMV offer significantly more combat capability than we would have gotten with just a replacement for the Bradley in that formation. And so while you may see other brand new vehicles, at the end of the day, a combat vehicle is about a box and a mobility system and a lethality system and communications and some other things. And if you can take all those things and put them on an existing vehicle, then maybe you don't have to have a whole new vehicle from scratch given the risk associated with that kind of development. We do know where the limits are, right? So when you start looking at Bradley and you say, are we limited by the powertrain, for example, because of the size of the engine cavity in the Bradley? You do run into those limits, and it's there where you may need to replace the hull, for example, but maybe you retain some elements of the existing vehicle. AMP-V is a great example of that, where you've got a brand new hull, but we were able to build it on the schedule that we built it on because it maintained some of the Bradley legacy design. But it is a new hull from a force protection and size standpoint, and you really do see that when you see it on the floor. You can see the additional space inside the AMP-V that you wouldn't get inside of a Bradley. But if we were to bring in a new unproven powertrain, that just adds risk on top of that. So we've been doing this, I think, to build new capabilities in an incremental way over time. It's also what our budget supports. So, I'd love to have replacement programs today for Abrams and Bradley. And we could lay in those, the plans to go do that. But it doesn't fit in this portfolio in this budget environment. And so instead, we're looking at, do you want to do an ECP3 on Bradley, or do you want to bridge to a new platform? And we've got some decision points laid in that sort of allow us to make an informed decision on what technologies you just can't get at evolving your system.
Yes.
Steve Miller, Military Technology. I think the General just hit on what I think is one of the hidden success stories that doesn't get too much press, unfortunately, and that's the more of a logistics benefit to a degree, but it's significant, with the M109A7, the Bradley, the AMPHI, the great deal of commonality and logistics supportability in that. That's a move that's been in some time being developed and is now a success story, as you can see, being implemented in front of us. But how do you intend to try to continue that? Because now you have possibilities of a new system and an MPF, so on and so forth. We've got a great success, and now we find ourselves potentially, corrupting that, if you will.
I'm going to ask Colonel Miller to talk a little bit about the commonality of AMPHI and those other platforms, and then I'll talk about MPF, if that's okay.
So right now, the AMPHI is about 60, 70% common with the Bradley A4 that's going through its testing now. And more importantly, though, it's practically 100% common with Bradley and PIM, A4 PIM and the A7 Paladin in terms of its drivetrain, its engine, its transmission, final drive, track, suspension, shock absorbers, everything like that. Those are all common parts now. So we're all buying the same parts. We're supplying the same parts to the field. They only have to carry one kind of track for those three different vehicles. And it's been a good success story there, especially from the logistics side. They're really excited about having that commonality, having to carry a lot of stuff around the battlefield and to supply a lot of stuff. That's a win for us. Maintaining it is not an easy process, though. It's a labor of love between Jim's group and mine. Every time we see something we may want to change to make it a little better for one platform, we got to make sure we don't break that commonality for the other platforms at the same time. So it's a constant process of reviewing. So yes, we finally achieved that common platform concept, and we're finding that there's challenges with that too. So we're hitting those hard and working through them.
So on MPF, I think it's important to remember that MPF is going to be unique in an IBCT no matter what we do. And so I think we're just now getting to the start of doing the analysis on what that means for the IBCT force structure for fuelers and ASL and all the other things that it's going to take to support a tracked vehicle inside an IBCT formation. And so making it common with ABCT won't really help me on MPF, at least not at this point.
So just to add on to that, so one of the benefits of commonality in the ABCT is if you have all those multiple platforms using the same parts, you're able to reduce the total number of parts that are carried, and the amount of tasks that the maintainers have to get trained on can shrink a little bit. They kind of get that common look and feel. The IBCT is going to be a different formation, fighting off on its own, and so you won't really get that benefit inside the IBCT. Now, there would still be some commonality benefits at the wholesale level when the Army's buying, transmissions. There would be some benefit, but I think it'd be smaller, and certainly we wouldn't see the training advantages for the mechanics inside the IBCT. So I think in this case, the business case advantages of wanting to look at what's already out there in the marketplace and having the different vendors bring us fairly mature solutions and what we're going to get out of that in terms of price and capability is probably going to outweigh what I think would be more marginal benefits from commonality between MPF and the ABCT platform.
This is an area, though, where I got to give General Dynamics some credit for their tech demonstrator that they provided. And what they did was they started with the presumption that there's an opportunity to leverage all the Army's investment in Abrams. And so they're carrying that turret design and electronics and LRUs over from Abrams to their tech demonstrator, which is a pretty smart way of going about offering a benefit maybe that the Army might not have thought of. So this is exactly why I think competition is such a great thing in this space, because we want to get the good ideas of all of our industrial-based partners as well as our partners in the organic S&T community on how to best do this. So I'm not giving any preference to one vendor solution over another, but I'm appreciative of the thought that went into that idea. This may be a dated question, but has anything happened with the Victory architecture and development, anything about C4ISR, sensors, in terms of this point about commonality, development, everything like that? So each of the ECPs we're doing bring elements of the Victory architecture, and we're starting to see the adoption. The real payoff on Victory is, I think the obvious business case on Victory is when we start to go towards assured position, navigation, and timing. And so the replacement for the current Dagger GPS receivers is something called M-code, which the Air Force is developing and the Army going to be providing to the Army. It's more jam resistant and some other things. Well, it turns out those are not as cheap as the old one. And so having a common Victory architecture on the platforms lets us share position, navigation, and timing data with all the boxes that are on that platform. So we really only need to buy one or maybe two GPS receivers for a given platform instead of having to buy that over and over again in every box that provides it for themselves today. So today on the platform, and it's mainly for timing, you know, the jammer has its own GPS, the radio has its own GPS, the platform brings its own. We have some platforms that might have 6 or 8 GPS chips on them by the time you load all those boxes. And with that common Victory architecture, you can buy it once, share it on the Ethernet that's already in the platform, and do it in a way that's open. Now, we think there's other business cases beyond that. And in fact, we've asked, recently we got some results from A.T. Kearney did some analysis for us on the business case associated with this, and it pays for itself really quickly.
Any other questions?
For MPF, do you have a timeline for when you're hoping to field that? Is there a long-term roadmap for that?
I think our goal right now is FUE in 23. We're going to see what we can do to pull that to the left because, again, in keeping with our strategy, we're going to do a tech maturity evaluation as part of the source selection. So when we get the proposals in from industry, we're going to be measuring how far along their design is. So we're, grading them on the capability they bring relative to the requirement set, but also how far along is their design. We'd like to see PDR plus level of maturity. So depending on how mature the solutions are that we select, may allow us to trim some of that design and build time that's built into the EMD. So that time could possibly pull to the left, but it's really going to be dependent on what comes in, as well as to a certain extent the funding level.
So milestone-wise, it's milestone B in 19, and then FUE in 23, which is only 4 years from the start of that program with meaningful resources. And what that means is that industry has a couple of years to get ready for that competition. And we're asking them to make that investment. And in exchange for that, we have to be very confident about what our requirements are. The time it takes, I'm going to take you back to design, build, and test. When you start dividing up that 4 years, we don't just design it and build it and put it in the field. We design it and we build a few. We build some prototypes. We shake those out and test. We refine our design, and then we put it into more significant production. And so I don't personally believe that that programs will go better if we just try to do that in one iteration. Right? There's lots of experience in history out there that says when we try to just make one cut through this without having the ability to build prototypes first, do some testing on them, understanding the design, updating the design, and then building more, it's significantly more effective in the product out the back end. The JLTV program is probably one of the more recent examples of that. We had a 3-year EMD program on JLTV. Everybody said they were production ready. There were changes made to every single vehicle as a result of that EMD program, and so the JLTV that you see on the floor today has benefited from that in terms of reliability, in terms of cost, and you get something when you take the time to do a meaningful competition and to drive towards a more mature design before you build a lot of something. If you're really urgent, you go back to the MRAP program. We didn't bother with low rate production or with prototypes on MRAP. We said go, right? But you have to have that is only for those things where you don't have the luxury of, and it's not really a luxury, where you can't take even the time necessary to build some prototypes and learn. Because the last vehicles that came out of MRAP were nothing like the first vehicles that came out of MRAP. and you pay for that in dollars. And so in a portfolio like this, with the budget we have, we cannot afford to point a money gun at this problem. We have got to be smart about how we buy.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Question about the APS system overall. Do you think it's eventually possible to develop an APS system that might be able to intercept the depleted uranium stable? The Russians claim they can do it. I don't think they're telling the truth. I just wanted to hear your take on it. The second part is, can you just go over the timeline for the MPS?
The target set that you talked about, right, the threat you talked about, which is a kinetic round, is a challenging target set for any APS. And I'll just leave it at that. As far as the timeline, I'll pitch it back to Glenn.
Right. So, again, we essentially have two activities. The expedited activity, which is the install and characterize. We'll conclude our characterization activities at the end of fiscal 17. Actually, for Bradley, that'll roll into 18. It's just a much more difficult platform to install because of its space, weight, and power challenges. From that point, it really depends for those systems. Does the Army have an urgent need, and are we willing to accept whatever risks and limitations those systems may have? And that will determine what the time frame is. If you ask me to pull out a crystal ball, I would say if the Army accepted every possible risk, you're still probably 18 to 24 months to fielding from that point, because that's simply the time it takes to lay in the supply chain and build the systems. Despite claims, the vast majority of APS systems that are on the market are not actually in production, don't have warm production lines, and so you just can't go and buy them to install them. You have to lay all that work in. So you're looking at between the time you place your order, build the components, assemble them, get them to a site, install them on the vehicle, train the crews, and then say, okay, I have a significant formation that's ready to go. That's an 18 to 24 month process.
And by the
if you
way,
want to make any changes, then you add engineering time in to refine your design, build a prototype, verify that the design changes work before you go into production.
And that 18 to 24 months isn't driven by a bureaucratic process. It's driven by activities. And so, another data point, so that the turret that Kongsberg is going to produce for the striker lethality vehicle has a supply chain that includes about 5,000 parts. Okay? Laying in a supply chain doesn't happen overnight. And so it's not too hard for companies to show demonstrators or tech demonstrators where they sort of build a one-off of something. And they can do that pretty quickly. But that's different than saying we're going to lay in a supply chain for a production line. And so, I had just gotten back from the PIM production line out in Oklahoma. And what impressed me most about that production line was all the bins that were full of parts. And that's a lot of right now what AMPI is doing, is filling the bins with parts to make sure we can manufacture those prototypes. And that's the difference between, say, a tech demonstrator or a 20-year-old M8 that's sitting out in the courtyard and the ability to manufacture more of them. So just because you see one doesn't mean you can build others. And so the M8, for example, has, if you go out to that vehicle today, that powertrain isn't available, the electronics need modernization. There's things we know that industry needs to do to get ready for our competition. And so even if we wanted to go a whole lot faster, there still needs to be some time for them to get their designs ready. Otherwise, the fairly aggressive schedule that we've laid out would not be credible.
Sir, do you have any closing comments?
I think I just stole them.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and thank you all for your time this afternoon. If you have any follow-on questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.